Good evening, and thanks so much for coming out this evening. The issue of the way in which civil liberties protection should appeal to people, regardless of where one falls on the ideological spectrum, has been an interest of mine for many years. I've been writing about it for a long time, and so I'm really glad to be part of an event that is designed to bring that idea to life by bringing together people who are ideologically disparate, who come from different places on the political spectrum, and yet who are committed to the idea of the preservation of these core liberties and are traveling around the country in an effort to talk to as many people as possible and persuade them as much as they can that these liberties are worth protecting. And so I'm really grateful to the Future of Freedom Foundation and Young Americans for Liberty for putting together this tour, on which we are now on the third leg. The context of the concept of civil liberties is a pretty complex topic, and I've been speaking about civil liberties now for 4 or 5 years around the country at college campuses and other places, and there's a lot of different approaches one can take to how one speaks about these issues. And for the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, in 2009 and 2010, I would speak to a lot of events and a lot of gatherings, typically liberal or progressive gatherings, about the state of civil liberties in the United States. And when I would devote myself to the argument, to making the claim that President Obama has largely continued the core essence of what made the Bush-Cheney war on civil liberties and approach to terrorism so controversial. And for the first couple of years during the Obama presidency, when I would go around and make that argument, I would typically have to devote the bulk of my time to systematically examining each policy one by one that proved that that was the case, going through them all and demonstrating the evidence to show that there was actually this continuity, because even people who were willing to be critical of President Obama, even people sympathetic to a civil liberties agenda, were just resistant to the idea that Barack Obama was continuing these policies that progressives and President Obama, before he was president, so long railed against. After all, George Bush was this swaggering, unilateralist, warmongering cowboy, and Dick Cheney was basically Darth Vader, the spawn of Satan in the eyes of progressives. How could it possibly be the case that the constitutional legal scholar, the progressive, urbane sophisticate, Barack Obama from Harvard Law School would be continuing these policies? It was just counterintuitive, inconceivable really to lots of people, and so I'd have to spend my time systematically proving that it was so. Well, 3 years into the Obama presidency, now going into the fourth, that's no longer necessary. I don't need to go policy by policy to persuade anyone that this is true, because it's become so glaringly obvious, so self-evident, that this continuity is virtually complete that very few people need to be convinced of it any longer. We've heard a lot of the policies from Jacob and Jack that persist, that were once known just 3 short years ago in Democratic Party circles as shredding the Constitution, that are now known as Obama's tough approach to terrorism. So I think they're pretty well known. And so rather than spend my time doing that, I want to instead look at 2 other questions regarding civil liberties that I think are more interesting and more significant at this point. One is, what are the effects of this continuity? What are the consequences from having now a Democratic progressive president continue the policies that were just a few short years ago the symbol of right-wing radicalism, so that now both parties have adopted these same policies? And then secondly, and I think even more importantly, why is it that we should care that this is happening? Why do we care about these civil liberties issues? Jacob talked about how the founders considered them very important, how they're part of our heritage, and all of that's true, but that doesn't seem to be enough to convince people that they ought to value them. The mere fact that the founders considered them important, or they're embedded into the Constitution, there have to be arguments more compelling than that to get people to be concerned, maybe even people in this room who need to understand more viscerally why these dangers are very real. And so I think it's worth talking about that as well, both so that we can understand it and get others that we talk to understand it. So the first issue that I want to talk about, as I said, is what are the effects of the continuity of these policies, the fact that both parties have adopted them. And to begin that discussion, I just want to share with you an anecdote, a personal anecdote that I experienced that is somewhat embarrassing. but I'm going to go ahead and share it with you anyway because that's just the kind of self-sacrificing person I am. And what happened was, I talked about what I would talk about when I gave civil liberties speeches in 2009 and 2010. When I would give them in 2007 and 2008, I would typically go around and talk about the way in which George Bush and Dick Cheney were eviscerating the Constitution in what seemed to me at the time to be pretty unprecedented ways. And my focal point was on Republican radicalism and the way in which, since 9/11, these liberties had been systematically eroded. And typically what would happen, almost in every case, what would happen is somebody would stand up afterwards during the question and answer session and ask a question. And this actually happened, I remember most vividly, at a speech that I gave to Jacobs Foundation, the Future of Freedom Foundation in 2008. When I spoke there in early 2008, somebody would stand up, and usually they were some independent type or nonpartisan type. In this case, it was a self-identified libertarian. He said, look, I agree with the critique that you're making of the Republican Party and their assaults on civil liberties. I'm with you completely in that regard, but you seem to think that the solution is to remove the Republican Party from power and put a Democrat in, a Democrat who admittedly is vowing to uproot these policies and reverse them, but isn't it far more likely that once a Democrat gets into office, into the Oval Office, even one who vows to reverse these policies, that they're going to instead become enamored of these policies and keep them, and that even worse than that, his supporters, because they're loyalists to the party, will change from opposing these policies to supporting them? Isn't it just going to be a continuation, no matter who we vote for, Republicans or Democrats? And every time I would get asked that question in 2007 or 2008, I was really quite dismissive of that concern. And I would say something along the lines of, look, I can't predict the future, and I'm sure there'll be a few Democratic loyalists who are willing to support whatever their party does, including policies that, a year before they were vehemently denouncing. But I really can't envision the progressive faction in the United States tolerating their party or their president supporting these same policies, because even if they're tempted to do so out of partisan self-interest or loyalty, even if they want to do it, just out of sheer embarrassment, they'll be unable to, because they have been so invested in this framework of grievances during the Bush years. They've been so vocal in their denunciation that these policies are a grave assault on everything sacred, that there's no way anybody could look themselves in the mirror with that level of intellectual dishonesty and stand up and support or even acquiesce to policies that they've been screaming and yelling about for so many years, simply because the power structure in the United States has changed in terms of which party is in control. And every now and then, in fact, even a little bit more frequently than every now and then, I have this sort of fantasy that I could find out the names of all the people who asked me that question, and find out where they are and fly around the country and personally apologize to each of them, because I have never been more wrong about anything since I began writing about politics. Because what we've seen is President Obama embracing enthusiastically, not just failing to uproot as he promised, but affirmatively embracing every one of those policies. We've seen him invoke the state's secrets privilege as a way to shield executive conduct from judicial scrutiny. We've seen him continue indefinite detention and military commissions. He's accelerated many of these policies that were once so controversial, like perpetuating an unprecedented war on whistleblowers and prosecuting them under espionage statutes, waging a war in Libya, not just without congressional approval, but even in the face of a congressional vote denying authorization, and most disturbingly of all, seizing the power, not just theoretically, but in practice, to target American citizens for execution by the CIA without a shred of transparency or due process. We've seen him embrace all of these policies one after the next, with not only liberal silence, but really liberal support by and large. And it's all predicated on the same framework that drove the Bush-Cheney approach to civil liberties, which is that because we are in a war, a global war, the president's power is literally limitless. Nothing can constrain it in any way, not statutes, not congressional oversight, not courts, or anything else. He's free to do whatever he wants to whomever he wants, provided there's an accusation of terrorism made in secret and in an unproven way. And what's really remarkable is I actually have been talking about this dynamic for the last 2 days, and it just so happened that this morning there was a poll release by the Washington Post and ABC News that found that 78% of Democrats and 53% of liberal Democrats, 78% of Democrats, 53% of liberal Democrats, now support Guantanamo Bay and want it to continue. They oppose its closure. And something like the same percentage supports President Obama's continuation of the use of drones, which is slaughtering Muslim women and innocent men and children by the hundreds. He's even targeting rescuers who show up after the first drone strike, and then he sends another drone to kill the people who show up to rescue the injured and bring away the corpses on the theory that they're probably in some way associated with the bad people we've just killed, and even targeting mourners at the funerals of those people. Liberal Democrats support that use of drones by something like 53%, and the drone program itself by something like 80%, and those numbers stay fairly consistent even when they're asked if they support the use of drones against their own fellow citizens without charges of any kind. And actually, I saw this poll when we were on a plane coming from Nashville from Indianapolis this morning, and I even though I had already written something this morning, I couldn't restrain myself. I had to go and write about it again because I found it so extraordinary, and I wrote about it under the very subtle and understated headline, Repulsive Progressive Hypocrisy. That's what I called it. And it was really just so amazing to me to see the intellectual dishonesty quantified in that way. And just to give the most illustrative example of how extreme it is, if you look at what the controversies were during the Bush years among progressives and liberals in the civil liberties context, there were really two most significant ones. There were a couple others, but two significant ones were, number one, that George Bush and Dick Cheney were spying on the communications of American citizens without first going to a court and getting a warrant. That was a huge scandal in the end of 2005 when the New York Times exposed it. The second scandal was that George Bush and Dick Cheney were imprisoning people without trial or charge of any kind at Guantanamo and even on U.S. soil in the case of Jose Padilla, an American citizen. So this was an extraordinarily radical assault on our liberties, said liberals and progressives almost in unanimity. The idea that George Bush and Dick Cheney or any president could eavesdrop on or detain American citizens without due process. And here you have President Obama not only eavesdropping on Americans without due process and not only detaining them, but now targeting them for assassination. And you have almost no liberal outrage of any kind. The ACLU is suing over it, there are pockets of anger, but by and large there's complete acquiescence and support for it. And we've seen this too with the Republican Party as well. If you go back and look at what the Republican Party and the American right was very angry about in the 1990s, they were outraged and scandalized by the idea that Bill Clinton could eavesdrop on Americans by going to get warrants in secret at the FISA court that they were very angry about because it met in secret and issued warrants without anyone knowing about it. And yet 3 short years later, when their own party was in power under George Bush, they not only supported the secret FISA court, they supported eavesdropping by George Bush without warrants of any kind. A complete reversal. And so this is what happens is people's concerns for civil liberties by and large seem to extend only to the extent that they can use it opportunistically to undermine the other party in power and not out of real conviction. And what the result of that is what we see now, which is that because President Obama has embraced these same policies, they've been transformed from what they were just a few short years ago, which was the provenance of Republican extremism, sparking all kinds of divisive debates where 50% of the citizenry was in favor of these policies and 50% was opposed to them or pretending to be opposed to them. He's transformed them from that divisive issue into bipartisan consensus, so that they're no longer the policy of one party opposed by the other. They're now the orthodoxy of the American political class itself. And what happens when a policy in the United States gets transformed into bipartisan consensus is it gets removed from the realm of mainstream political debate. It becomes entrenched for generations. There's lots of examples where scholars have proven that this is true. When Franklin Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, the Republicans devoted themselves to and vowed to uproot it, and yet the very next president whom they elected, or Republican president, was Dwight Eisenhower, who just tinkered at the margins of the New Deal but didn't uproot it, and therefore the debate went away and it became a permanent fixture in American political culture, no longer debated and entrenched and protected for the next 6 decades. And the same thing happened when Lyndon Johnson ushered in the Great Society programs, and the Goldwater Republicans of the 1960s were devoted first and foremost to reversing this expansion of federal power, and yet the next Republican president whom they elected, Richard Nixon, not only didn't uproot it, but accelerated and continued those domestic programs, and those got removed from the realm of debate and then therefore became entrenched as permanent fixtures as well. That's exactly what has happened with this assault on civil liberties that Democrats once feigned opposition to but now have embraced. These policies are no longer debated. That's what these polls show, that adherents to both parties now accept them and embrace them. And there is no way to uproot or even challenge them within the two-party system, or at least the party leadership and the establishment, because it has become solidified as the policy of how American political culture functions. Not anything aberrational, but now it is the norm. That's an extremely significant development for those of us who care about civil liberties, is that there's no one party of the two political parties that provides a vehicle for challenging them any longer. Both political parties, at least at the leadership level, are devoted to their preservation. So that's what I think is the most significant effect of this continuity. And then that leads to the question, why should we care? And I actually think this is a very hard question to answer, not an easy question to answer. It's easy to answer if you want to be glib about it or operate on a really theoretical level. And to say things like, well, these rights are what make us American, or it's embedded in the framework of who we are. These are things that I think are all completely true and that I find persuasive, but I don't think they're viscerally compelling. They're not enough to get people to place these issues at the top of their list of concerns. And the reason for that is because most of us in this room, maybe all of us in this room, do not wake up in the morning with a list of worries that includes prominently the fact that the government is going to be knocking on our door and taking us off to Guantanamo, or that it's going to send drones over our house and shoot a Hellfire missile and explode us and our families. And the reason for that is because those things have largely been done to Muslims, to mostly religious Muslims who challenge in some extreme way American government power, and anyone unfortunate enough to be near them at the time those things are done to them. And so it's very easy to say, well, I feel as though these threats are not very acute in my life, and I also feel like it's being done only to people who are sort of different and kind of over there and foreign, even when they're American, and therefore I don't actually feel very threatened by these things. I actually kind of am glad on some level that the government is doing them, because where there's smoke, there's fire, and even though there are probably some innocent people who are wrapped up in it, most of the people who are being subjected to these oppressive policies are probably guilty of something and mean us some harm, and so on some subconscious level I'm even glad for it. And so I think it's very important, if you want to convince people that they shouldn't think that way, to have clear reasons why these policies are in fact much more threatening than the mindset that I just described suggests. And so I just want to talk briefly about a few of the reasons why people who even believe they're not acutely affected by these developments in fact are. And to do that, I just want to begin with another anecdote, one that isn't actually embarrassing, unlike the first one. I don't think. I'll leave that for you to decide. But before I began writing about politics, what I did was I litigated constitutional cases. I defended individuals who alleged that their constitutional rights were being violated by the government or other actors. And I litigated, in particular, a lot of First Amendment cases, people whose free speech rights were being violated. And in the course of that work, I represented lots of people with pretty heinous viewpoints. People who were avowed white supremacists or even neo-Nazis, people who were very extremist in their anti-immigrant animosity, who even believed in the need for violence and other things as a means of addressing that. That's true of most people who do First Amendment work. The ACLU famously represented neo-Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, a community of Holocaust survivors. And what people who do that work would often encounter in terms of a question or an objection, and what I encountered often was the question, well, look,
I support free speech rights, and I understand the idea of representing people whose First Amendment rights are being violated, but why do you have to represent those people with those extremely heinous views? Can't you find somebody with less repellent viewpoints and represent them as a means of defending the First Amendment? And the answer that I would always give is really the only answer that you can give, which is when the government sets out to seize power, the power to cross certain lines and violate certain rights, its tactic in every case in the first instance is to target the most marginalized and despised people in the society with the expectation that nobody will care because it's being done to those who are most marginalized. And that really works. If you look at who it is that's typically targeted in the first instance, it's usually the most unsympathetic figure, and people think, well, look, I'm comfortable having the government do it to those people, not to me, but or anyone like me or my neighbors down the street, but to those people it's fine because they really are bad people. And the problem is that once you accept or acquiesce to the government's abuse of authority in that one case, it becomes institutionalized, it becomes legitimized, and therefore there is no way to stop it any longer. Once it's time to apply it in a case that you're uncomfortable with, by then it's much too late. And so I think one obvious way of trying to convince people that they should care about civil liberties abuses is to say, well, if you vest the power in a president whom you like to do something, at some point that president's going to leave office and there's going to be a president whom you dislike, but they're going to be vested with that power. So I know during the Bush years when I used to argue with conservatives and try and get them to join civil libertarians in opposing the assaults by their party, I would say things like, well, do you really want Hillary Clinton being able to eavesdrop on whatever conversations of yours that she wants or reading your emails without warrants? And now when I try and convince progressives and liberals to be more concerned about what Barack Obama is doing in the civil liberties front, I'll say things like, well, are you really comfortable with Newt Gingrich or Sarah Palin or whoever, you know, the progressive villain of the moment is, Michelle Bachmann, being able to have the power to sit in the Oval Office and order American citizens assassinated with no checks or accountability or transparency of any kind? And that is a rationally intuitive argument, but it doesn't really work because people are focused on short-term political gain. They want their party to remain in power, and so they're not really interested in opposing their own party. They need to be convinced that their personal interests are actually at stake in something more immediate than some future speculative threat. And so I think there's a few actual dangers that come from these erosions that are immediate and acute. They're not easy to explain, but they, I think, are very compelling and are worth examining. So the first one is that when you institutionalize government power, it always, not sometimes or usually, but always and inevitably gets applied beyond its original application. So even if you're comfortable having the government assassinate certain people that you believe are bad people who should be extinguished without a trial or anything else, it's always the case that that power will extend beyond the original application. And you can see this over and over and over. Powers that were seized in the name of the drug war have been applied to almost every type of criminal case. The Patriot Act that was justified in the wake of 9/11 has been used to spy on all sorts of political groups on American soil and other kinds of dissident groups. Over and over you see the extension of these abuses. So you can never be confident. In fact, you can never believe that abuses of power will be limited to their original application, because they never are. They always will expand outward in ways that you can't anticipate and can't control. The second reason to view these erosions as threatening is that they are intended to destroy the space and the ability for citizens to dissent. The purpose of civil liberties is to protect the government from punishing those who have minority views. It's never the case that if you're somebody who has a view that is conventional or accepted by the majority, that the state will target you for suppression. Or if you belong to a religion that is practiced by the majority or acceptable to the majority, that your religious liberty will be infringed. There are exceptions when that does happen, but by and large, The people whose rights are targeted are those who are in the minority. Civil liberties in the Constitution was designed to protect minority rights from the will of the majority. It's designed to preserve a space for dissent and challenge to convention and orthodoxy and political power. And if you allow the government to encroach on these lines and to signal that it is able to target people who are deviating from orthodoxies and punish them in ways that the Constitution prohibits, you eliminate this ability to dissent and challenge orthodoxy. And even if you're somebody who at the moment is comfortable with that because you're not a dissident and don't want to be and are comfortable with the prevailing wisdom, what mores and prevailing orthodoxies change very rapidly. And people who are in the majority today can easily find themselves in the minority tomorrow. And the power and ability to dissent and to challenge convention and orthodoxy is one of the most valuable attributes a society can have. That's where progress and creativity reside. And what civil liberties erosions do at their core and what they're designed to do is to prevent that from happening, to compel conformity. If you conform and you embrace the prevailing mores, you will never be targeted by the government. They'll be happy with you. It's only people who want to deviate and dissent who have that threat. And civil liberties are designed to ensure that and to protect that, and this erosion eliminates that right, and it's dangerous. And it's a harm for all of us, even those of us who don't at the moment want to dissent. The final reason why we should care about these civil liberties erosions is related to that, but it's a little bit more subtle, but I think even more important. And that is that what happens in a country that allows the government to attack and assault civil liberties is that a climate of fear gets created, which radically changes the relationship between the government and the citizenry in all sorts of detrimental ways. I just want to tell a little story about what happened to highlight how that's true in a really concrete way. I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years writing about the controversy relating to WikiLeaks, the organization that is devoted to bringing transparency to government, and I've been a fairly ardent supporter of and defender of WikiLeaks and their right to do this. And the very first time that I wrote about WikiLeaks was in January of 2010. And this was before anybody had really heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they had engineered any of their news-making leaks, before they even published the video of the Apache helicopter in Baghdad firing on civilians and killing Reuters journalists. And I hadn't heard of WikiLeaks at the time, and the way that I learned of WikiLeaks was that the Pentagon had prepared a top-secret report in 2008 in which they described WikiLeaks as an enemy of the state. And they prepared this report that set about ways to plot about how they could destroy WikiLeaks. They talked about submitting fabricated documents to WikiLeaks so that when they published them, their credibility would be destroyed. They talked about learning the identity of their sources so that nobody would feel comfortable leaking to them any longer. A whole variety of ways of how they wanted to destroy WikiLeaks. And in fact, if you look at how WikiLeaks has been destroyed, that report actually sets out a pretty good guide for what happened. But in any event, this report was designated top secret, but somebody leaked the report, ironically, to WikiLeaks, which then published it online. And I read that report. It was online. I read that report. There was a short article about it in the New York Times about how the military and the Pentagon had designated this transparency group an enemy of the state. And at the time I thought to myself, well, you know, any group that is designated an enemy of the state by the Pentagon, in which the Pentagon is plotting to destroy, is probably a group that deserves a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. That was my reaction to it without knowing anything about it. And I went and I did a lot of research about it and saw that they had done some incredible things in terms of bringing transparency to corporate corruption and government corruption around the world. And I wrote a long article about WikiLeaks, and I interviewed Julian Assange, and I published the article that I had written, and I published the interview I had conducted with him. And at the end of this article, I had encouraged people to donate money to WikiLeaks because they were suffering from budgetary constraints. They were sitting on a lot of big leaks that they were unable to process because they didn't have the money for it and for the staff for it. So I encouraged my readers and others to go and donate money to WikiLeaks. I gave links to their PayPal account and instructions about how you could wire money to them. And in response to that article, I got this reaction from huge numbers of people that I didn't anticipate at all, but was extremely revealing. I had huge numbers of people say to me in response, in the comment section to my article, by email, at events like this, look, I understand completely your arguments about the potential and promise of WikiLeaks, and I agree with you about the value that they can bring. And I want to support WikiLeaks. You convinced me that I should. My concern, my problem is that I'm worried that if I donate money to WikiLeaks electronically by wiring money to them or sending them a check or PayPaling money to them, that I'm going to end up on some government list somewhere. Or even worse, subjected to criminal liability if at some point they're designated a terrorist organization that I could be prosecuted for providing material support for terrorism. And the reason why that was so striking to me, why that was so amazing to me, was because WikiLeaks was a group, WikiLeaks still is a group, that has never been charged with any crime, let alone convicted of any crime, nor could they be. What they do is pure journalism. They get government secrets from government employees that expose government corruption, and then they write about it and publish it, what newspapers do all the time. And yet here were huge numbers of people, literally dozens and dozens and dozens, not people prone to paranoia and sort of manic conspiracy theories, but people well-rounded and rational who were worried, fearful of exercising their core First Amendment rights, which is what donating money to a political organization whose cause you support is. It's pure right of free speech and free association. They were petrified of doing it because of this climate of fear that had been created, and so they voluntarily relinquished their own constitutional rights. They were afraid to exercise them. No one needed to put them in prison. No one needed to put a gun to their head. No one needed to arrest them. They did it on their own because they know they live in a country where their government has been permitted to cross all of these lines, including lines that the Constitution says you can't cross. And the climate of fear that results means that people will refrain on their own from exercising their rights. And if you go into Muslim communities and talk to people there, American Muslim communities, people who are American citizens, like everybody in this room, they'll tell you the same thing, that there are people sitting in American prisons who have been prosecuted for materially supporting terrorism, for doing nothing other than aggressively critiquing American foreign policy. If you look at how protesters have been treated, both in the Tea Party and especially the Occupy Wall Street movement with excessive police force, there are lots of people who wanted to go to those rallies and participate in them, but who were afraid of being pepper sprayed or put into prison. This is what civil liberties erosions do, is they create a climate of fear that makes citizens unwilling to exercise their own rights. The socialist activist Rosa Luxemburg once wrote that he who does not move does not notice their chains. And I just think that's so profound, because what that essentially is saying is that there are millions of people who think that they're not being oppressed, who think that civil liberties erosions are not a direct threat to them, because they think that everything that they want to do, they're able to do. And yet what this climate of fear does is it intimidates people out of dissenting, out of engaging in the kind of activism that the founders sought to preserve as the only means to check political leaders. It reverses what should be the dynamic, which is those who wield political power fearing citizens, and transforms it into the opposite, the hallmark of tyranny, which is citizens fearing those who wield political power. And so even people who say to you, I don't see how I'm being affected by civil liberties erosions, I don't feel like there's anything that I want to do that I can't, are in fact affected in ways that they may not even perceive. So the last point I want to make is just a comment on the political movement with which I'm rightly or wrongly often affiliated or identified, which is the progressive movement in the United States. And one of the things that's so fascinating and sort of tragic about what has happened in terms of civil liberties erosions and the way that liberals and Democrats and progressives have acquiesced to them is that if you look at what progressives and Democrats have long viewed as sort of the black marks on American history over the last 60 years, what you would typically hear them identify are things like the internment of Japanese Americans in camps without due process, even though that was done by FDR. It was the American left that was vocal in opposition to it. Or the witch hunts of the McCarthy era that were resulting in punishments of people by government, those in government power without due process. Or the illegal spying by J. Edgar Hoover on the communications of American citizens without any oversight for purely political ends. And if you look at what progressives have long considered to be the crown jewels of their legislative successes, it's things like the Freedom of Information Act to compel the government to disclose what they're doing to the citizenry, or the War Powers Resolution to prevent the government from going to war, the president from going to war without the consent of the American people through their Congress, or the Church Committee revelations of the mid-1970s that exposed decades of abuse of surveillance power by the government and resulted in laws like FISA that said that you cannot surveil our communications without first going to a court and convincing a court that there's reason to do so. The essence of all of those events, the core premise, is that we cannot allow power to be exercised by the government without all kinds of checks and limitations, all kinds of legal constraint and transparency. And that is all what has been completely discarded. First by the Republicans in the immediate aftermath of World War II, of the 9/11 attacks, and now by Democrats. You can find these trends for a lot longer before 9/11, but they've become accelerated drastically in the wake of 9/11. And the fact that they're embraced by both political parties means that if you want to challenge them, you need to do something either to subvert the leadership and establishment of both political parties, or work outside of those two parties and joining together with citizens, regardless of how ideologically disparate they might be on other issues, and realizing the commonality that we all have to defend these liberties, because it's in our interest, our common interest, to defend them. So with that, I thank you very much for listening, and I will turn it over to Bruce.